So I bought a new green screen, I bought lights, I bought stands, I sound dampened the entirety of the garage, I even got a new camera and put everything on a teleprompter, but my face is still too damn pale to put on camera. Ah, screw it, I'll fix it in post. First time I think I've ever gone on camera on this channel, so hello! Those of you who have been with me from the beginning know that when I started this channel doing mediocre Let's Plays, I was in film school, which, based on my current employment status, was a mistake. And while my debt will consume me like one's kid consumes their personality, I continue to ignore my growing fiscal irresponsibility through a strict cocktail of frivolous spending and video games, which led me to buying Dragon Quest XI. Ah, it's beautiful. Now, I don't think I have to tell you that Dragon Quest XI is fantastic. I mean, God knows, you already know that. However, Dragon Quest XI is guilty of a certain gameplay sin that I've been noticing a lot more over the years, especially in the JRPG genre. We don't really have a term for this in gaming, at least not one that I'm aware of. But, in film and really writing of any kind, there's a very similar concept which denotes when a writer is explaining too much through exposition rather than through actions. It's a concept known as show, don't tell. And it generally works out pretty great. I mean, we've all seen the episode of a TV show or a movie where a character explains a vital concept to another character in a way that no one has ever really spoken. And this is done for the purpose of explaining the setup to the audience. But because it's so awkward, it immediately suspends your disbelief, and the show gets canceled before the season even ends. So unless you're a master of dialogue, show don't tell is generally a pretty good rule to follow.
What does that mean, whoever's behind the bomb's behind the children thing? Like they wanted him out of the way or something?
Lois.
But with games, we have to take that a step forward, because games are an interactive medium. And now that we're in fully realized 3D worlds, just showing your player your world isn't really going to teach them enough to immerse themselves within it. So, what can you do? Well, the easiest solution would be to have a character come on screen and introduce the current scenario. And yeah, plenty of games use exposition, but generally speaking, you want your player base to actually play the game. So instead what you want to do is play, don't tell. So why am I harping on about this after playing Dragon Quest XI? Well, because Dragon Quest XI is guilty of doing what a lot of modern JRPGs do by running a cutscene, letting you walk about 20 to 30 seconds, and then running another cutscene. And it'll do this repeatedly. Watch. Cutscene. Walk. Cutscene. See? Here's another one. Cutscene. Walk. Cutscene. See? And now let's look at Xenoblade 2. Cutscene. Walk. Cutscene. And now let's try Ni no Kuni 2. Cutscene. Walk. Cutscene. It's just like when Navi in Ocarina of Time used to interrupt the flow of the game just to tell you what you're already doing. I don't need this much context to walk 10 feet. Now, this is obviously a problem with more story-focused games, of which JRPGs are usually heavily reliant on. But it didn't always used to be this way. Early JRPGs were fairly good at condensing their stories to the necessary bits. Back then, game developers knew that no one was interested in reading a novel that looked like this. So they had to be selective with the story they told, and when possible, let the game itself tell the story. And given how many of these franchises are now AAA titles, you can't argue that it didn't work. But ever since the PS1 era, when the technology made it possible for extended cutscenes and full 3D animation to be used to tell aspects of the story, game developers have started to rely on these methods of storytelling rather than using the gameplay itself. They've not yet learned what screenwriters figured out so long ago. In order to make your story engage the viewer, it must be weaved into the action. Likewise, if you're going to make your game story compelling, you have to weave the story into the action of the gameplay. Now, of course there's exceptions. We need only look to games like the Persona series to see a JRPG that's so heavily reliant on story, it's almost a visual novel. But the Persona games do something very clever that actually allows story and gameplay to function almost completely independently. From Persona 3 to Persona 5, there's always two components to the hero's quest: his journey within the real world, where he interacts with his friends and family and lives out his daily life, and his journey within the alternate reality where the beings known as shadows exist. These worlds not only exist to separate the hero's secret life, but also to completely separate gameplay elements. Those of you who have played Persona games have probably already figured this out, but the real world is where almost all of the story elements of the game happen, and the alternate world is where all of the RPG mechanics happen. This allows the player to separate in their mind what they're going to experience when they play the game. And for the most part, they are given a choice as to how they spend their time. they can grind, they can progress in the story, they can do quests, they can grow their bonds with their friends. Either way, every component is carefully isolated so as not to interfere with the other elements in the game. And because time management is so important in this game that if you finished it, you could actually put it on your resume, the player is forced to be selective with how they spend their time. This means that whether you are experiencing story or whether you are experiencing combat, you are making the choice. You are choosing to engage in these activities. The player has a certain degree of control over how they play the game. And this is what makes non-RPG games with story elements work. You have the choice as to how you're going to spend your time. At some point you'll have to go back to the story, but that time doesn't have to be right now. Now, obviously this isn't absolute, because until recent developments, Telltale's entire design concept was based on doing the exact opposite and making games almost completely devoid of gameplay. Focusing on The Walking Dead, for instance, because that's the one I actually own, the story is the gameplay. Your decisions, your choices, your interactions within the story all have weight to what happens next. So your conversation trees feel like they actually matter. And the first time you play, you won't know whether they did or didn't until it's too late. Now that does limit the experience to one perfect method of playing that's very easy to figure out, but it makes for a first time experience that really stays with you, and I believe that's what those kind of games were going for. Not necessarily replay value, but immersion of player and story, which is hard even for great game designers. And unfortunately, most JRPGs haven't figured this out yet. And since those PS1 era changes caused developers to start to rely on cutscenes to tell their story, this led to the formulaic anime PS2 JRPG. A great example of this is the Namco Bandai series Xenosaga, especially Episode 1. Xenosaga made the silly but understandable mistake of having a cutscene that lasted way too long, to the point where when I originally played it, I fell asleep. A lot of other games did the same thing in the PS2 era, since we were now at a time where movie-like stories were possible in your average video game. But this led to a lot of long story sequences you had to sit through before you could play again. And I think that's where the fundamental problem lies. The game is taking away your freedom to play it, which I think is something that people are starting to take notice of. Have you noticed in the last few years, some of the most highly regarded games like Super Mario Odyssey, Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, Spider-Man, and God of War are all games that make the story something that isn't really in your way? Like, let's look at those. Super Mario Odyssey has a story, but it takes a backseat to the gameplay. It's a Mario game. Story is not paramount. But the structure of the gameplay allowed you to fully explore a world right from the get-go. Same story with Breath of the Wild. There's definitely more story here, but you don't have to take part in it. Heck, you can explore almost the entirety of the world without even visiting any of the dungeons. Spider-Man was just like this. There's a story, it happens, but it never runs too long. And when it stops, you have the option to play this for as long as you want. Giving the player a choice as to what they get to do when they turn on the game is key. And this doesn't even require your game to be open world. Like God of War. While I didn't love this game, what I can say I respect about it was that a large portion of the story was weaved into the conversations between Kratos and Atreus while you play the game. Most of the character development happens while you're exploring, and Atreus attempts to bond with his father.
Aren't you sick of hearing about him and his brother?
Of course. But it serves nothing to make an enemy of him.
Yeah, there's still some long cutscenes in there at times, but they're not frequent enough in number so as to make it intrusive or annoying. And I'm not saying you can't have cutscenes. Lord knows, movies still have dialogue. And even in the early days of cinema, expositional text was still needed. But to pretend that movement is a sufficient enough gameplay element to warrant moving to the next cutscene, it's a little bit insulting to the player. If you can't weave gameplay into the narrative, that's fine. There isn't always an easy solution to this. Just don't break up the cutscenes with walking, and ideally, find a way to convey your point faster. I get that a lot of games are going for the cinematic approach now, and that storytelling in many games has become increasingly similar to movies. But there are things you can get away with in each medium that are simply not compatible with the other. Now, is there a way for, say, Dragon Quest XI to fix this without reverting back to the PS2 trend of really long cutscenes? Honestly, I don't think so. I don't think you can actually fix this with the game they've currently built. At best, you'd have to make every scene have skippable dialogue, and even then, that's not really solving the problem, that's just putting a band-aid on it. So, I guess, write your story better? I mean, I hate saying it like that, but if you can't get it across faster, or you can't weave it into the gameplay another way, your story is just going to become intrusive. And that's not what any writer should want. Of course, maybe it's just me. Maybe I just prefer a game that immerses you with gameplay now rather than story. Maybe it's just that my tastes are changing as I'm getting older. I don't know. I just feel like telling your story with cutscenes It's not the ideal way to do it, and you should try to weave it into the gameplay more. That way the player feels like they're part of it. I don't know. What do you guys think? Am I being too hard on this? Are you annoyed too? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know what you guys think, and I'm glad that some of you are still around, so thank you for watching. Have a good one.